Now, there are precedents for all of this. Many of you might know that there are tons of dying and rising gods in the ancient world. This is often modern scholars, especially who like Christianity, insist on trying to deny this, but I've documented extensively. The evidence is very clear and undeniable that there were at least these 5 that predate Christianity as dying and rising gods. Osiris, I just mentioned. Osiris, incidentally, if you're baptized into his death and resurrection, you're saved in the afterlife. Does that sound familiar? Adonis is another one. Romulus is he's not a personal savior, he's a savior of the empire, but he has a lot of similarities. His death and resurrection has a lot of similarities with Jesus. But his passion plays, they were actually enacted passion plays of his death and resurrection throughout the Roman Empire as part of his holiday. So Jews who were coming up with their idea of a dying and rising savior god had these models out there in public to look at. Zalmoxis is another one. He's a Thracian / Bulgarian / Celtic, we're not sure, dying and rising god. And when you share sacred meals in his honor, you get to be saved in the afterlife. Does that sound familiar? But he's talked about in Herodotus. And Herodotus was a standard school text for anyone who learned Greek at the level necessary to compose creative texts like the Gospels. So in fact, every single Gospel author, we know for a fact, would have read Herodotus and therefore would have known about Zalmoxis. Now, the oldest of these that we have on record is Inanna. I do think it's interesting that the first dying and rising, and in fact crucified god in history was a woman, and then almost all the others turned into men suddenly. You can make of that what you will, but in her case, she descends to hell, is stripped naked, tried in a kangaroo court, is stricken dead by a death spell, and then her naked corpse is nailed up. 3 days later, her minions come down, feed her the food and water of life. She resurrects and ascends to glory. So this crucifixion narrative goes way back. She was the principal goddess of the city of Tyre, which was one of the major port access cities to the region of Judea. So any of you also know the Gospels, Jesus supposedly visits the city of Tyre. So if Jesus existed, he would have been preaching right beside the temple of another crucified deity that people were worshiping, crucified, resurrected deity. That would be an unusual coincidence. But I want to warn you against the bad parallels. There are a lot of attempts to argue for parallels with other gods that don't hold up. We can't really prove them, or they're just false. The Horus parallels, please don't cite those. We can't really establish those as being as strong as they sound. The others are the ones that I mentioned. Those we can prove a great deal, but the Horus parallels, not so much. Mithra is another one. Oftentimes people will say Mithras is a dying and rising god. That's not the case. There were Gospels of Mithras. None of them survive. But we do have this, which is the comic book version. It's basically the graphic novel of the Gospel of Mithras. And scholars have looked at this and have looked at snippets of writings and discussions of Mithraism in literature and figured out that it does not seem that Mithras himself is a dying and rising god. However, he does undergo some suffering, some sort of passion, where he endures some great struggle through which he gains victory over death. And that's the key parallel. So even though he is not a dying and rising god, he still fits the paradigm of these gods. Now, personal savior deities were all the rage at the time. And what they all had in common were these. They were all savior gods, most of them personal saviors. In other words, if you believed in them and got initiated into their cult, you would get saved in the afterlife. Christians didn't invent this. In fact, they're the latecomers. These savior cults, personal savior gods, were already the rage before Christianity arose. They are all the son of God, occasionally the daughter of God, as I mentioned, but in any case, the child of God. They're not the God themselves. They're some sort of agent of God who is recognized as his child, or literally his child. They all undergo a passion, the same Greek word, patheon. They all have passion stories and some of them passion plays, but they all undergo what passion means is some sort of suffering or struggle. It's something that humanizes them in that sense. They all obtained victory over death, which they share with their followers. That's the point of them. They all have stories about them set in human history on Earth. Every single one of them has something equivalent to the Gospels that's placing them in human history as actual humans walking around. Yet none of them ever actually existed, which means if Jesus existed, he's the outlier. He would be the extraordinary exception to all of these other cases, and that means we need some evidence to back that he's different than these gods. Otherwise, we should expect that he's probably the same as all these others. So here, that's the pagan context that would have influenced this Jewish innovation. But any form of syncretism takes, from the Jews or any other religion, you combine two ideas to make a new one. And what the Jews did is they would take pagan ideas from surrounding cultures, Judaize them, make them Jewish compatible, and then create a new version of Judaism. And this happened before. When the Persians conquered Judea, back in the 539 to 332 BC, roughly in that period, the Jews were heavily influenced by the Zoroastrian religion, which was the principal religion of the Persian Empire. The Zoroastrians were the ones who taught a general resurrection, for example. These are the things that Zoroastrianism was teaching. They taught the idea of a war of a good god versus an evil god, that there was some bad celestial being involved, light versus dark. The idea of bad people burning in some sort of hell and good people waiting in heaven, that was their idea. A river of fire would someday be sent by God and flow over the universe, burning everything up, even hell itself. That was their idea. A new and better world will be created in its place, Zoroastrian. And all the good people will be resurrected by God to live in that new world happily ever after, Zoroastrian. None of these beliefs were a part of Judaism before the Persian influence. Afterwards, all of these things were adopted and incorporated and became standard Jewish beliefs among many sects of Jews, not all of them. So syncretism happened. Jews did this. We know they did this. But the key thing here is, then the Greeks conquered Judea. Then the Romans conquered Judea. The Jews wanted to be the master race, but their God kept giving that title to somebody else. But if the Persians influenced the Jews through that, when you have the Greek conquerors, you have the Roman conquerors, you have hundreds of years of influence, you're going to see syncretism again.